Picture this. You're 28 years old, and you're standing at the casket of a man you have never once seen in your entire life. You don't know how he laughed, whether it was loud and open or quiet, whether he threw his head back or covered his mouth with his hand. You don't know how he took his coffee in the morning, black, no sugar, or with cream and 2 spoonfuls of something sweet. You don't know if he was afraid of the dark or of heights, whether he loved the rain, whether he could cook, whether he fell asleep with the TV on. You don't know the sound of his voice, whether it was deep or not, whether he spoke fast or slow, drawing words out or cutting them short. You know absolutely nothing about this man. Except one thing. Your whole life, you were told he chose this, that he left, that one ordinary morning he simply picked up and walked away into a different life, a life without you, that you didn't matter enough to him to stay, that some people are just built that way. When things get hard, they run, and they don't look back, and that your father was exactly that kind of person. You believed that for 28 years. Because there was nothing else to believe. No alternative ever existed. There was only this one version of events, repeated so many times and with such absolute certainty that it became part of you. Part of how you see people. Part of the reason you never let anyone get too close. And now, you're standing at his casket. In a city you've never been to, surrounded by people you've never met. People who all somehow seem to know exactly who you are, who are watching you. Quietly, carefully, with an expression you can't quite decode. And then, an elderly woman walks up to you, small, in a dark coat, white-haired, and when she takes your hand in both of hers, her grip is surprisingly strong. She holds on like someone who wants to make sure you won't fall. She looks you straight in the eyes. And she says, quietly but with absolute clarity, slowly, like she is weighing every single word. Your mother lied to you. He never walked out. He spent every day of his life looking for you. 7 words, 3 sentences, and something inside me cracked, quietly, without a sound, the way ice cracks under your feet. First one fracture line, then another, and only then do you realize you're already going under. That is where my real story begins. Not in childhood, not in my mother's kitchen, not even at those funeral doors, but right there, in those words. In everything I had to do afterward with a truth I never asked for, never saw coming, and honestly, was not ready to receive. Because there's a difference between wanting to know the truth and having it show up uninvited and dismantle everything you thought was solid ground. My name is Jennifer, and I want to tell you about a lie that knew how to look exactly like love and protection. About a man who was taken from me before I ever got the chance to know him. About a woman who convinced herself she was doing the right thing, and maybe even believed it. And about 27 letters my father wrote me every single year, not knowing if they would ever reach me, not knowing if anyone would ever read them at all. Before I go on, if stories about truth that was hidden for too long, about people who refused to give up even when everything was stacked against them, about the cost of silence and what happens when it finally breaks, if stories like that mean something to you, please hit like and subscribe, and drop a comment letting me know what city you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single comment, every one, without exception. Now, let's go all the way back to the beginning. I'm 8 years old. I'm sitting at the kitchen table after school, eating a sandwich, and I ask my mom, "How come Dad never comes to my birthday?" She sets her cup down on the table, slowly, carefully, and she looks at me the way people look when they want their words to last, to stick, preferably forever. There are things parents plant in their children so early and so deep that those children spend the rest of their lives mistaking them for their own beliefs, never realizing that they don't actually think this way on their own. They were told to think this way. Early enough, consistently enough. Enough times that it became part of the framework the child builds to understand herself and the people around her. It isn't manipulation in some crude, calculated sense. Sometimes the person doing it genuinely believes every word. But the result is the same either way. The child grows up carrying someone else's convictions as if they were her own. I was told my father left when I was 1 year old, that he chose a different life, one without a family, without responsibility, without us. That he was a weak, irresponsible man who valued his own comfort more than his own child. That when things got difficult, and things always get difficult with a baby, that's just part of life, everyone knows that, he simply walked out because he wasn't ready, because he never wanted to be ready, because people like him are never ready for anything that costs something. This came from my mother, Carol, a beautiful woman with tired eyes and a straight back. The kind of woman who carried herself in a way that made pity feel like an insult. She raised me alone, paid every bill alone, sat through every parent-teacher conference alone, stayed up alone through every fever and every sore throat. I saw her exhaustion every single evening, in the way she pulled off her shoes at the door, in the way she stared at nothing for a long moment before starting dinner. And I drew the only conclusion available to an 8-year-old. He caused this exhaustion. He left and dropped all of this on her shoulders. He was responsible for everything hard in our lives. There were no photos of my father in the house, not a single one. I asked about it once. I was about 9, and my mother said it without hesitating. She threw everything out the moment he left. She didn't want reminders in her home of a man who didn't care whether we existed. I accepted that completely. It even seemed logical to me. Why keep photos of someone who betrayed you? What I didn't understand then was that a photograph isn't just a memory of a person. It's evidence that they existed. And without evidence, it becomes very easy to rewrite a story. There were no letters from him either. No calls, no birthday cards. Not when I turned 8, not when I turned 10, not at 15. Not ever. And this, my mother explained, was the most convincing proof of all. If a man wants to know how his child is growing up, he finds a way. People always find a way when something truly matters to them. If he didn't find a way, then it didn't matter. Simple as that. That logic seemed airtight to me. Until I was 28 years old, it seemed completely unassailable. The picture my mother painted was consistent, coherent, and internally seamless. Not just a bad father, not just a man who made a mistake, but a specific type of person. The kind who runs at the first sign of difficulty, the kind who will always choose personal freedom over responsibility. The kind you simply cannot trust. Not because he's evil, but because he's wired that way. because he already proved what he does when things get uncomfortable. That picture, quietly, like water finding cracks in stone, seeped into the foundation of how I saw people in general, men especially. Anyone who started to matter to me, especially. I wasn't aware of it. It wasn't a conscious decision not to trust people. It was simply how my perception worked. It was the background noise that was always running. Every relationship I had when I was young followed the same script. Things would start out well. The person was interesting, I was myself, everything felt possible. Then they would start to become important. Really important. Important enough that their absence would register, would leave a gap. And that's exactly when something inside me would switch on. Not full-blown panic, more like a quiet, constant background unease. Like smelling smoke and not being able to find where it's coming from. And I would start pulling back. Methodically, calmly, barely noticing I was doing it. I'd find reasons. We're too different. This isn't the right time. He's too caught up in his own life. I'm too caught up in mine. The reasons changed every time. The outcome never did. I told myself, I'm just a realist. I just see people clearly. People leave. Sooner or later, for one reason or another, people always leave. And I'd rather not be in a position where someone else leaving can do something to me. That's not fear. That's just common sense. That's what I told myself. My mother never talked about my father loudly or bitterly. No outbursts, no scenes, no cursing his name. She spoke quietly, calmly, with that particular, specific kind of weariness that persuades you far more powerfully than anger ever could. Because weariness looks like lived truth. She didn't forbid me from thinking about him or asking questions. She simply dropped one phrase, one detail, one quiet sigh every time his name came up. And each time, the picture got a little clearer, a little more final, a little more like a door with no handle on the inside. I grew up with all of that, became an adult woman, and I carried with me the conviction that some people simply are not built to stay. That this isn't a character flaw, exactly, it's just how they're made. And that my father was exactly that kind of person. I was wrong. But understanding that required me to start asking different questions first. And that didn't happen on its own, and it didn't happen quickly. I was 16 the first time I tried to find him myself. Not out of tenderness. Tenderness wasn't anywhere close to what I was feeling. More out of anger. That specific teenage impulse where you want to look someone in the face and say it straight. So, how's your life? Are you happy? You made your choice. Here it is. We made ours. And we did just fine without you. It wasn't a search driven by longing for closeness. It was a search driven by a need for explanation. Or maybe just a need to finally say out loud everything that had built up over 16 years of silence. The internet existed then, but not the way it does now. I typed searches, scrolled through results, looked for any trail at all. But I didn't have a name. My mother had never once said my father's name out loud. She always said, "your father." Always those two words, without a name attached, as if a name would make him too real, too specific, too much of an actual human being. I tried searching by our last name. Too many results, none of them obviously him. So I tried a different angle. There was an elderly woman in our building, Norma, who had lived in the neighborhood since before I was born and knew everyone on the block. I went to her under the pretense of helping with something around the apartment, and asked her, as casually as I could manage, which probably wasn't very casual at all, whether she remembered my dad, whether she'd known our family back then. Norma looked at me for a long moment, not frightened, but very careful, with the particular expression of someone who knows something they don't want to be pulled into. Then she said quietly, "You'd better ask your mama about that, sweetheart. It's not my place to say." And she changed the subject. That carefulness put me on edge. Not scared, on edge. If the answer were simple, she would have just answered. People don't sidestep simple questions. They sidestep complicated ones, the kind where there's something worth protecting. I asked my mother directly. No setup, no softening. I want to find him. I just want to know where he is and how he's doing. Nothing more than that. She listened to me without interrupting. Then she stood up, walked to the kitchen sink, and started washing a mug. Washed it for a long time. A mug that was already clean. Then she said, without turning around, looking out the window above the sink, "You can look if you feel you need to, but you won't find anything good. Some people disappear from other people's lives on purpose. You have to respect that." I backed off. Not because I believed her completely, but because I saw something in the set of her shoulders that I didn't want to disturb. Some kind of tension, some closed-off quality that said, "This hurts." And I, the way children do when they love their parents and don't want to cause them pain, chose not to push. But the splinter stayed. And then something happened that I still remember in exact detail. Every sound, every smell, the precise weight of an envelope in my hands. It was an ordinary fall afternoon. I got home from school early. Last period got canceled. My mother was at work until 6. I went to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and saw an envelope on the table. A plain white envelope, slightly worn at the edges, the way envelopes look when they've been carried around in a pocket or a bag for a while before someone finally sends them. No return address, not even our home address. Just my name, written by hand in neat, slightly angular handwriting I had never seen before. Clearly a man's handwriting. I picked it up, turned it over. It was sealed, carefully, completely. And then I heard a key in the front lock. My mother was home early. Her shift had ended unexpectedly. She came into the kitchen, took off her coat, glanced at the table, and I watched something change in her face in an instant. Not fear exactly, something more complicated than fear. Something that closed off in a fraction of a second before you could name it. She walked over and took the envelope out of my hands. Calmly, without any hurry, the way you take something that belongs to you and ended up somewhere it shouldn't. She said, "This isn't what you think. Junk mail. I'll throw it out." I watched her turn the knob on the gas stove. Watched her hold the envelope over the burner, holding it by the corner so she wouldn't burn her fingers. Watched it catch. One corner first, then the other, then the middle. She set the burning scraps in the sink and ran the water. She did all of this in silence, methodically, as if it were completely ordinary, as if she burned envelopes every day and thought nothing of it. I didn't say a word. I stood there and watched. And something inside me, quietly, without any drama, without any words, said, "That was not junk mail." Nobody addresses junk mail by hand to a 16-year-old girl in handwriting that isn't her mother's. But I was a 16-year-old who was afraid of hurting her mother, who could see the exhaustion her mother carried and didn't want to add to it, who had gotten very good at swallowing the questions that felt dangerous. And so, I stayed quiet. I backed down for the third time. Except now, the splinter was deeper, and there was no pulling it out anymore. At 22, I left. My own apartment, my own job, my own life. Built carefully and deliberately, the way an architect builds a structure. Foundation first, then walls, then everything else. I was intensely focused on independence, on not needing anyone so much that their leaving could break me. That felt like maturity to me, like wisdom earned from watching someone else's example. Now I understand it was armor, just very convincingly disguised as personality. I worked at a small design studio. I was drawn to work with a concrete, measurable outcome, where you can see what you're producing and control the result. Where if something goes wrong, it's your mistake, your responsibility, and you can fix it. No unpredictable variables, no people who disappear without warning and without explanation. I had friends, real ones. I wasn't lonely in any way that was visible from the outside. But there was a line I didn't let anyone cross. Invisible, but absolutely real. They felt it, anyone who was paying attention. One of them, Melissa, said it to me directly one afternoon. We were sitting at a cafe and she said, without any setup, "Jen, you are the only person I know who can be completely present and somehow still feel like you're behind glass. You're totally here, and at the same time, you're just slightly out of reach. How do you do that?" I laughed. I said, "That's just how I'm wired. You know I'm an introvert." She shook her head, but didn't push. Melissa has a gift for sensing when someone has closed a door, and a gift for respecting that without trying to break it down. But I knew it wasn't just personality. I knew, in that place where you know things you don't want to acknowledge, exactly where it came from. I just didn't want to dig, because digging meant reaching something that would hurt. And I had become exceptionally skilled at avoiding pain. My relationships were short, not because I didn't meet people worth staying for. I did, more than once. But every time someone started to matter, something switched on inside me. Not full-on anxiety, more of a low, steady background hum of unease, like smelling smoke and not being able to find the source. And I would start pulling back, calmly, quietly, barely noticing I was doing it. I'd find explanations. We want different things. The timing is off. We're both too busy for something serious right now. The explanations rotated. The result was always the same. I told myself, I'm just realistic. I just understand how people work. People leave. Always. Sooner or later, one way or another. And I would rather not be standing in a position where someone else's leaving can do anything to me. That's not fear. That's just sense. That's what I told myself. Around 24, Melissa and I were at her place, drinking wine, talking about life in general. She asked me about my father. Not aggressively, not with any pressure, just asked, the way you ask something you've been meaning to ask for a while, but kept putting off. Have you ever tried to find him? For real, as an adult, with all the resources you have now that you didn't have at 16? I said what I genuinely believed. Why would I look for someone who never looked for me? If he wanted to know, he would have found a way. People find a way when it matters. So it didn't matter. Melissa was quiet for a second. Then she said, very carefully, The way you say something you don't want to land wrong but need to say anyway. Are you sure he didn't look? Do you actually know that? Or is that what you were told? I said, those are the same thing. She didn't argue. She never argues when she can see someone has shut down. But that question stayed. It caught somewhere at the edge of my mind and wouldn't let go. Quiet and persistent, like a word you can feel on the tip of your tongue but can't quite reach. Do you actually know? Or is that what you were told? I worked hard at not thinking about it. I had a project due, a deadline, rent, plans for the weekend. Life continued. Steady, predictable, safe. And hollow in that one specific place where other people seem to have something. Something warm that they call by a simple, almost ordinary word. Roots. The sense that you came from somewhere, that something stands behind you. I didn't have that. All I had was my mother's version, the only one I had ever known. And a burned envelope I remembered even when I tried not to. Until the morning, everything changed. It was a Tuesday in early March. An ordinary workday. Gray sky outside, coffee in a thermos, a to-do list on the screen I was working through one item at a time. Layout approval, revisions on a presentation, a reply to a client who'd been waiting since yesterday. A measured, predictable, controlled day. My phone was on the desk next to my keyboard, screen facing up. I have a habit of keeping it that way so I can see notifications without picking it up. An unknown number appeared on the screen around 11 in the morning, an area code I didn't recognize. Normally, I don't answer unknown numbers. I let them leave a voicemail if they have something to say. This time, I picked up immediately. I don't know why. I just did. The voice on the other end was older, male. Very deliberate, the way people speak when they've thought carefully about every word before saying it. When they know that what they're about to say could change something significant, and they don't want to handle it carelessly. He asked, "Is this Jennifer?" I said yes. He said, "My name is Robert Haynes. I'm an attorney. I'm calling regarding your father." His name was Thomas. He passed away 4 days ago. He left written instructions that, in the event of his death, you were to be contacted. He left something for you, something he wanted to give you himself, but wasn't able to. I'd like to meet with you in person, as soon as possible if that's workable for you. I didn't answer right away. I stared at the screen in front of me, at the to-do list, at the presentation notes, at the cursor blinking in an open document, and tried to process what had just happened. My father was dead. The man I had never seen, who walked out when I was 1 year old, who chose another life, according to my mother, and never once looked back. That man was gone, and before he died, he had left instructions to find me, had arranged it, had made it part of his final affairs. People who don't care about something don't make it part of their final affairs. I asked, and I didn't try to hide the edge in my voice. Why? What does he need from me now? He went his whole life without once making contact, and now, when he's gone, suddenly there needs to be a meeting? The attorney paused, not flustered, just letting the silence exist without rushing to fill it. Then he said gently, but very clearly, "I understand how you're feeling. I can hear that you're angry, and that makes complete sense. But I think when you hear what he wanted to tell you, you'll understand why it mattered so much to him that you know. The truth was the most important thing to him. That was his main wish. The truth." That word stopped me. Not because I instantly believed anything, I didn't, but because something inside me responded to it before my mind could object. That place where you carry things you know but don't say out loud. The splinter from when I was 16. The burned envelope. Norma's careful eyes. Melissa's question. Do you actually know, or is that what you were told? I said I'd think about it. He gave me his number and address and, after a brief pause, let me know that the funeral was in 2 days, in a town about 4 hours away. If I wanted to come, he understood it was a lot to ask, that the decision was entirely mine, that there was no pressure either way. But Thomas had wanted me to know about the funeral. We said goodbye. I put the phone down, and I sat completely still, staring at nothing, for probably 15 minutes. Then I stood up and went to the window. An ordinary street, an ordinary Tuesday. People going about their ordinary business, some with coffee cups, some with dogs, some with headphones in. Life completely unchanged. I opened a browser and typed in his name, Thomas, and the last name the attorney had given me. I found an obituary in the online archive of a small-town newspaper. Short, name, dates, a few lines. And a small photograph. A man in his mid-60s. Gray-haired, with attentive eyes that looked directly into the camera. Not tense, but serious. The face of someone who thought before he spoke. I stared at that photograph for a long time, looking for something familiar. The shape of his nose, the way his eyes sat, anything at all. I don't know if I found it. I don't know if I was really looking for it or looking for something else entirely. Then I closed the laptop, stood up, walked to my closet, and started pulling things out for a bag. I was going to the funeral of a man I had never known. With no plan, no idea what I would find there, no clarity on what I would do with any of it. But the splinter, that same one from 16 years ago, from a burning envelope over a gas flame, was saying one thing, steady and clear. Go. You need to hear this. Whatever it costs you, you need to hear this. And so I went. I almost turned around twice on the drive there. Once about an hour in, when I pulled off at a gas station and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes with the engine running, telling myself I was being irrational, that this was a stranger's funeral, that I owed this man nothing, not my presence, not my grief, not my time, that whatever the attorney wanted to give me could be mailed, that I had work on Monday and a life I had built carefully and deliberately, and driving 4 hours to stand over the casket of someone I had never met was not something a rational person did. The second time was when I crossed the town line and saw the sign. A small town, the kind where people know each other's cars and notice when an unfamiliar one parks on their street. I felt suddenly, acutely visible. Like I had no idea what I was walking into, or what these people expected from me, or what role I was supposed to play in something I had never auditioned for. But I kept going both times, because the splinter kept saying, "You're almost there. Don't turn around now." The funeral home was a modest white building on the main road through town. There were maybe 40 or 50 people gathered outside when I arrived. More than I expected for a small town, though I didn't know what I had expected exactly. I parked across the street and sat in the car for a moment, watching people file in slowly. Older couples, a few middle-aged men, several women around my mother's age. People who had known this man. People who had a whole history with him that I knew nothing about. I got out of the car. The moment I walked through the door, something shifted in the room. It wasn't dramatic. No one gasped. No one stopped mid-sentence. But I felt it. A subtle change in the air, like a collective intake of breath. Heads turned. Eyes found me, held for just a moment longer than normal, and then looked away. People leaned slightly toward each other. A few quiet words passed between them that I couldn't hear. They knew who I was. All of them, apparently. Every single one of them knew exactly who had just walked through that door. And I didn't know any of them. I made my way to the casket, stood there and looked at the man in the photograph from the obituary, now in front of me, real and still and undeniable. He looked smaller than I'd imagined, though I'm not sure why I'd imagined anything at all. His face was calm. The hands crossed over his chest were the hands of someone who had worked hard with them. I stood there and felt nothing I could name. Not grief. I had no grief for a stranger. Not anger. Not relief. Just a strange, hollow stillness. And then a hand closed around mine. She had come up beside me so quietly I hadn't heard her. Small, in a dark wool coat, white hair pinned back neatly. The woman I would later learn was named Margaret. She had been Thomas's neighbor for over 20 years, one of the people who knew him best. She took my hand in both of hers, the way I described at the beginning of this story. Firmly, deliberately. She looked at me and said it plainly, without softening it, without building up to it. Your mother lied to you. He never left. He looked for you his whole life. I stared at her. She didn't look away. She just held my hand and let the words sit there between us, giving them space to land. Within the next hour, 3 other people came up to me separately. A man named Dale, who had worked with Thomas for 15 years. An older woman named Ruth, who had been his neighbor before Margaret. A younger man, maybe 40, who said Thomas had helped him through a hard time years ago and had talked about me, his daughter, the way people talk about something they've lost that they never stop hoping to find. Each of them said some version of the same thing. He talked about you. He never stopped looking. He never gave up. He was not a man who left. I sat in a chair against the back wall of that funeral home, and I listened to 40 minutes of testimony from people who had no reason to lie to me. People who had nothing to gain. People who simply knew a man I had been told one story about, and knew a completely different one. By the time the service ended, the picture I'd carried for 28 years had so many cracks in it, I could see straight through to the other side. Robert Haynes, the attorney, found me after the service. He was a quiet, precise man in his 60s, with the kind of careful manner that comes from decades of delivering difficult information to people who weren't ready to hear it. He asked if I had time to sit down. We found 2 chairs in a small side room off the main hall, and he closed the door. He talked for a long time. I didn't interrupt. Here is what I learned. My parents met when they were both 19. Young, in love, and entirely unprepared for what life was about to hand them. My mother got pregnant. They were living together in a small apartment, both working entry-level jobs, both carrying debt they were barely managing. My father lost his job 4 months before I was born. A layoff, not a firing, but the timing couldn't have been worse. They fell behind on rent. They fell behind on everything. A neighbor filed a noise complaint. The walls in the building were thin. A baby crying at 3 a.m. carries. And a caseworker came to assess the home. She came back a second time, then a third. My father wasn't home during any of those visits. He was out looking for work. My mother was home alone each time, exhausted and frightened, and 20 years old. fielding questions about stability and income and living conditions from a woman with a clipboard and the authority to make decisions that couldn't be easily undone. The caseworker recommended temporary foster placement while the family stabilized financially. Temporary. That was the word she used. A few months, get back on your feet, then the child comes home. My mother signed the paperwork. What happened next, and Robert said this carefully, making sure I understood he was telling me what the documents showed, not what anyone wanted to be true, is that my mother moved. 3 weeks after I was placed in foster care, she moved out of that apartment, left no forwarding address with the agency, changed her phone number. And within 2 months, the foster placement that was supposed to be temporary became an adoption proceeding, because the biological parent had become unreachable. My father had not signed anything. My father had not agreed to anything. My father came back from a job interview one afternoon to find my mother gone and received a notice from the agency informing him that, due to circumstances, proceedings had moved forward. He hired an attorney immediately. He filed to contest the adoption. The filing was rejected on a procedural technicality. He had missed a deadline by 11 days, a deadline he hadn't known existed because no one had notified him properly. He filed an appeal. The appeal was denied. He filed a second appeal. Denied again. His attorney told him a third attempt would be very unlikely to succeed and would cost more than he could realistically afford. But he never accepted it. Over the next several years, he tried every avenue available to him. He hired a private investigator, twice. He wrote letters to the adoption agency that were never forwarded. He contacted the family courts in 3 different counties, trying to trace where I had been placed. Every door he found was either locked or led to another closed door. He found us, found the town where we were living, when I was 11 years old. He drove there. He sat outside the elementary school one afternoon, trying to get a glimpse of the daughter he hadn't seen in a decade. He saw me. He recognized me. Because, Robert said quietly, you look very much like your mother did at that age. And he knew her face better than any other. He sat in that car and watched me walk out of school with a backpack on, talking to a friend, completely ordinary and completely unaware. He didn't get out of the car. He was afraid of what a sudden reappearance would do to a child who didn't know him, afraid of the legal consequences of approaching without going through proper channels, afraid of disrupting something that, whatever its origins, had become my life. He drove home, and he wrote me a letter instead. It was not the last letter. It was the second one. The first had been written on my first birthday, sitting alone in the apartment my mother had vacated, not knowing where to send it. He wrote one every year after that. Every single year, on my birthday. 27 letters across 27 years. Sent to the attorney with instructions. Hold these. If I die before I find a way to reach her myself, make sure she gets them. I sat in that small side room and listened to all of this. And when Robert finished, I didn't say anything for a long time. I just sat there with everything rearranging itself inside me, slowly, heavily, like furniture being moved in a house that had been set up the same way for decades. Then I asked one question. I asked, did she know? Did my mother know he had been looking? Robert looked at me steadily. He said, based on what Thomas told me over the years, yes, she knew. She moved specifically so he couldn't find you. Whether she knew about every attempt he made after that, I can't say. But the original disappearance was not accidental. I nodded. I thanked him. I stood up and walked out into the cold afternoon air and stood on the sidewalk outside the funeral home, and I breathed. 2 days after the funeral, Robert Haynes met me at his office and handed me a box. It was a medium-sized cardboard box, the kind used for file storage, reinforced at the corners with extra tape. Heavy, heavier than I expected. He set it on the conference table in front of me and said, "These belong to you. They have always belonged to you." I looked at the box for a moment. Then I opened it. Inside, arranged in chronological order, held together in small bundles with rubber bands. Envelopes. 27 of them. Each one dated. Each one addressed to me, in that same neat, slightly angular handwriting I had seen on exactly one other envelope in my life. The one my mother burned over a gas burner on a Tuesday afternoon when I was 16 years old. I understood then what she'd burned. Not junk mail. Not a circular. A birthday letter. I had been 15 when that one arrived, which meant he had found our address by then, which meant he had been looking hard enough and long enough to find it. And she had burned it the same day it arrived, before I could open it. I picked up the first envelope. The postmark was from the year I turned 1. I opened it carefully. The paper inside was regular notebook paper, folded in thirds. The handwriting was the same, but younger somehow, less settled, the letters slightly less even, the way handwriting looks when the person holding the pen is not yet sure of themselves. He wrote, "I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know where you are or who is taking care of you, or whether you're warm and fed and safe. And not knowing that is the hardest thing I have ever lived with. You turned 1 year old today. I didn't get to see it. I want you to know that someone in this world was thinking about you today. That someone counted this day. That somewhere a candle was lit for you, even though you'll never know about it. I'm going to find you. I don't know how yet, but I will not stop." I read it twice. Then I set it down and picked up the next one, and the next. I sat at that conference table for 4.5 hours. Robert brought me coffee at some point and left it without saying anything. I barely noticed. The letters changed as the years passed. The early ones were raw, written from a place of acute, unprocessed pain, full of promises made to a child who couldn't hear them. As he got older, the writing steadied. He wrote about his life, carefully, not assuming I cared, just offering. He wrote about the town he lived in, the work he did, a dog he had for 12 years named Chester, who liked to sleep on his feet. He wrote about things he hoped for me, not dramatic things, just ordinary ones. That I had a best friend I could call at 2 in the morning. That I had found something I was good at, and that it brought me some satisfaction. That whoever was raising me was kind to me. He wrote when I was 17. "I drove past your school again last year. I know I shouldn't. I know it doesn't help anything, and it probably isn't fair to you. But I needed to see that you were still there. That you were real. You were walking with 2 other girls and you were laughing at something, and I couldn't hear what it was, but I could see that it was real laughter, the whole body kind. And I sat in my car and I cried for about 20 minutes. And then I drove home and wrote this." When I was 23. I hired another investigator this year. He found a current address. I wrote you a letter and sent it there. I don't know if it reached you. I don't know if you threw it away, or if it was intercepted, or if it's sitting somewhere you haven't found yet. But I sent it. I want the record to show that I sent it." I thought about that. I had lived at 4 different addresses since I left home at 22. I had never received a letter from an unknown sender at any of them, which meant either it hadn't reached me or someone else had made sure it didn't. The last letter was dated 7 weeks before he died. His handwriting had changed, slower, the letters slightly trembling at the edges, the handwriting of someone whose hands were no longer quite cooperating. He wrote, "I'm not well. I think I've known for a while, but now I know for certain. I've asked Robert to find you after I'm gone, if I can't manage it myself. I want you to have these letters. I want you to know that not a single day passed in 27 years when I didn't think about you. Not one day. Whatever you were told, whatever story you were given about who I was and what I did, I need you to know that the real story is in this box. Every page of it. I'm sorry I never found a way to hand it to you in person. That's the thing I'll regret the most." I set the last letter down on the table, the stack of opened envelopes in front of me. 27 years of a man talking to a daughter who couldn't hear him. 27 years of a voice going out into silence and never getting an answer. I put my head in my hands and I cried for a very long time. I waited a week before I called her. Not because I needed time to calm down. I wasn't sure calm was going to be available to me for quite a while. I waited because I needed to be clear about what I actually wanted from the conversation. And what I wanted, I eventually realized, wasn't an argument. I wasn't calling to punish her or to perform my anger for her benefit. I was calling because I needed to hear her say it. Whatever it was. In her own words. She picked up on the second ring, said hello in that familiar voice, steady, warm in the particular way that it always felt like safety. The voice I had known my entire life. The voice I now understood had been capable of a sustained, deliberate, decades-long lie. I said, "I went to the funeral." She was quiet. I said, "I met with the attorney. I read the documents. I know about the appeals, Mom. I know he contested the adoption. I know he looked for me. I know he found us when I was 11 and sat outside my school in his car and didn't get out because he didn't want to disrupt my life. I know he sent letters. And I know that at least one of them arrived." Silence on the other end. A long one. I said, "The envelope you burned when I was 15. That was from him, wasn't it?" She didn't say yes right away, but she didn't say no. The silence itself was the answer. Then she started talking, slowly, in a voice I hadn't heard from her before. Lower, heavier, like something she'd been holding up for a long time and was finally setting down. She said she had been 20 years old and terrified, that the situation with the caseworker had felt like the ground disappearing under her feet, that she had made a decision in a moment of pure panic and then found herself unable to undo it without admitting what she had done, that she had told herself the story so many times, the version where he was the one who wasn't there, the one who chose to disappear, that somewhere along the way she had stopped being entirely sure where the lie ended and what she actually believed began. She said, "I was trying to protect you. I didn't want you growing up waiting for someone who might never come. I thought it was cleaner, simpler." I said, "You thought it was simpler for me to believe my father didn't want me, than to know he was looking for me? She didn't answer that. I asked the question I had driven 4 hours for, the question I had been carrying since I first stood in that funeral home. Did you know he came to my school? That he sat outside and watched me? A very long pause. Then, yes. Someone saw his car and recognized him from before we moved. They told me. I said, "And you didn't tell me." She said, "I was afraid of what would happen if you knew." I thought about that, about an 11-year-old girl who had walked out of school that day laughing with her friends, completely unaware that her father was sitting in a car 30 yards away. About what that 11-year-old girl might have felt if she had known. About the choice that had been made for her, again, by someone who decided they knew better. I said, "I have to go." She started to say something. I said, "I'll call you when I'm ready. I don't know when that will be." I hung up. I sat by the window of my apartment for a long time after that. Not crying, not angry, just quiet. Thinking about the difference between protecting someone and deciding for them. Thinking about how often those two things wear the same face. My mother had not been a villain. That was the complicated part, the part that would take me a long time to sit with. She had been a frightened young woman who made a terrible decision and then spent 25 years maintaining it because the alternative was admitting what she had done. People do that. Ordinary, flawed human people who love their children do that. It doesn't make it right, but it makes it real. And real things are harder to deal with than villains. I went back. 3 months after the funeral, on a Saturday morning in early spring, I drove the 4 hours back to that small town. Not for the attorney, not for any particular errand, just to go back, to stand somewhere that had known him when I hadn't been allowed to. I visited his grave first. A simple headstone, gray granite, his name and his dates. A small pot of flowers someone had placed there recently, still fresh. I stood for a while without saying anything. I'm not sure what I would have said even if I'd wanted to speak out loud. I just stood there and let myself be in the same physical space as what remained of him. It felt necessary in a way I didn't fully understand and didn't try to. Then I went and knocked on Margaret's door. She opened it like she'd been expecting me, which maybe she had. She made tea without asking whether I wanted any, and set out a plate of cookies and sat down across from me at her kitchen table, with the particular ease of someone who understood exactly what this visit was for. We talked for 3 hours. She told me about him as a person, not as a father, not as a figure in my story, but as an actual human being who had lived in the house next door and borrowed her rake every fall, and once helped her carry an air conditioning unit up 2 flights of stairs when her son couldn't make it. A man who kept a garden and wasn't very good at it but kept trying. Who read history books and could talk about them for an embarrassing length of time if you let him. Who was quiet mostly, but laughed easily when something actually struck him as funny. The kind of laugh that made you want to be the person who caused it. She said, "He talked about you more than you'd expect. Not constantly. He wasn't the type to make everything about his grief. But sometimes, out of nowhere, he'd mention something. He'd see a girl on the street who walked a certain way, or someone would say something that reminded him, and he'd get this look. Far away, but also very precise, like he was seeing something specific. And he'd say, 'My daughter would be about that age now.' Or, just that year before he got sick, he said, 'I think she might be good at her work. I hope she likes what she does.' I don't know why, I just have a feeling she found something she's good at. I thought about my design job, the measurable outcomes, the controlled results. I didn't say anything. I went back 2 more times that spring. Met Dale, the man who'd worked with Thomas for 15 years. Met a woman named Susan, who'd been in a book club with him for a decade. Each of them gave me a piece of him. Small, specific, ordinary. Not heroic, not a saint. A regular man who had done something wrong at 20 years old by not fighting harder in the moment when it mattered, and had spent the rest of his life trying to make up for it in the only way available to him. Slowly, in the accumulation of those small pieces, something took shape. Not a father, not exactly. It was too late for that, and I had made my peace with the fact that it would always be too late for that. But something. A person. A real one. With a garden he couldn't get right, and a dog named Chester, and 27 letters in a box that he had kept because he refused to believe there would never be a chance to deliver them. And slowly, something else took shape too. Not forgiveness exactly. At least, not the kind that arrives all at once, clean and resolved. More like understanding. The slow, unglamorous kind that comes from sitting with something long enough that you can finally see the whole shape of it. My mother had been 20 years old and terrified. She had made a choice out of fear and then built a wall around it and guarded that wall for 25 years because taking it down meant facing what was on the other side. I know what that feels like. I had spent 28 years doing something similar, building different walls for different reasons, calling it maturity, calling it realism, calling it self-protection. We were not as different as I had wanted to believe. That doesn't mean what she did was right. It was not right. A child's right to know where she comes from, to know that she is wanted, to know that someone is out there looking for her. That is not a small thing to take away. It is not a thing that can be fully given back, even with 27 letters. Some losses are permanent. I know that. I am still living with it. But I also know this. I read every one of those letters. All 27. I've read some of them more than once. On my last birthday, I took the box down from the shelf where I keep it, and I read the one from the year I turned 28. The last one he wrote before he got sick. Before the handwriting started to tremble. He wrote about spring coming to his town. About the garden. About Chester being gone by then. About the quiet of a Sunday morning when there's nothing in particular you need to do. He wrote, "Wherever you are today, I hope something made you smile. I hope you're not too hard on yourself. I hope you know, even without knowing where it comes from, that you are someone worth knowing." I set that letter down on my kitchen table and looked out the window for a long time. I want to say one thing to you before I go. Just one thing. And I'm saying it as directly as I know how. The story you were told about yourself, whoever told it, however long ago, with whatever intentions, is not necessarily the true one. Some of the most important truths about who you are and where you came from are being held by people you haven't met yet, in boxes you haven't opened, in rooms you haven't found a reason to walk into. Not because anyone is hiding them from you right now, just because the path to them is longer and more complicated than it should have to be. You are allowed to go looking. You are allowed to ask the questions that make people uncomfortable. You are allowed to want the full story. Not the version that was handed to you, but the actual one, with all its inconvenient and painful and complicated pieces. My father wrote to me for 27 years, from a distance I didn't know existed. He held on to the hope that someday I would read those words. And I did. Later than either of us deserved, but I did. It is never too late to open the box. If this story reached something in you, if you've ever been handed a version of the truth that turned out to be incomplete, or if you're holding someone else's story about you and aren't sure it's yours, tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you're somewhere quiet right now, sitting with something heavy you haven't told anyone yet, I see you. I really do. Thank you for being here with me. Like if this story touched you. Subscribe if you want to hear more.